introduction. My name is Francois, as you may have now heard. I am an African debater. I am from South Africa and I've studied in South Africa as well. I have a majority of my experience has been in Africa as well. So being able to DCA the Pan-African Championships and making the grand finals is perhaps at the top of the list, but I've had some experience at Worlds as well in the ESL Quarter-Finals. And this year especially has granted me the opportunity to virtually cover the world and to judge at very prestigious competitions, which I previously probably wouldn't have had access to. So today's topic is really important. Africa is not a country is the title Africa is not a country. I think it's quite relevant because often it is viewed, such a large continent, 1.3 billion people, as one monolith or a collective, rather than as a complex continent with various moving parts where, of course, there is poverty, but there's also a lot of innovation. There is a colonial past, but there's also a history that is deeper than colonialism. There is a future which encompasses a free trade charter, which encompasses a lot of cooperation across the continent, investment, and infrastructural development that stretches far beyond most of the assertions debaters make about the African continent. So I think there's a few things that we will cover in this specific session. The first one is how we should be referring to African nations in debates. Secondly, is the African Union even functional or real? Thirdly, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and Monetary Union. And fourth and last, the modern warfare aspect. So looking briefly at the most important regional conflicts that exist contemporary in the world today, especially in Africa. So let's start off with the political map of Africa. So you can see that there are 54 nations, which makes it quite complex, stretching from as far as the south in South Africa, where I am right now, towards the north, countries that are far more friendly with Europe and with the Arab League. Especially in the north, you'll find that Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, as well as Morocco, have far better relations with the Arab League and also Europe because of their proximity to the continent. Morocco even briefly considered adopting the European or the euro as their formal currency, but they just have it pegged at the moment. So that is one of the things that separates the African Union, and we'll talk about that a bit later. In the West, you have a large political unity. Although there is conflict, it's perhaps the only, that collection of nations is called ECOWAS, or the Economic of West African States. They have perhaps made the largest strides towards monetary union. They have their own currency. They have movement across borders. They have a customs union. There are so many various things that we can talk about. Recently, Nigeria had a lot of conflict with the state, the NSAS movement, where there were separate military groups that would often use excessive power to clamp down on the public. The issue itself is complex, but what you should know is despite all of the complexity, West Africa has been moving towards a large-scale political and economic union. This will be important for the discussion going on. In the East, we have the Horn of Africa, which itself has massive amounts of history behind it, a lot of conflict as well, but it's also currently the target of massive amounts of Chinese expansion. Of course, you have in Ethiopia, in the north, the Tigray region over there, close to Eritrea, where the Ethiopian government is currently waging a conflict. In Somalia, this part here, just at the top of Somalia, where you see the name is called Somaliland, and they're also been willing or able to, or requesting to secede from Somalia as a whole. And moving south, of course, the majority of the countries here were previously occupied by the British. So Botswana, Zimbabwe have been, connected to the British colonially, as well as South Africa. But important is that South Africa is by far the strongest economically in the Southern African region, even though it's not as stable as maybe Botswana, maybe it is economically stronger than most nations. Of course, Africa isn't just continental. Most of the islands, the Comores, Madagascar, the Seychelles, and so on, are all important parts of the political map in which Africa exists. So if you're trying to understand Africa, I think it's useful looking at the map, dividing all of the different parts of Africa into their separate regions, and then as a result of that, then starting to make different associations with the position that those African nations are in. All right, moving on to the first point that really sets us up in this debate. Not debate to say, but how to refer to African nations in debates as a whole. So the first issue is how debaters refer to Africa. And I'm pretty sure, judging by the people in this workshop at the moment, the vast majority of you may have had frustrations about the way other debaters have referred to your country, oversimplified it, underanalyzed it, not treated it with perhaps the historical respect it deserves. And that's because debaters largely themselves only engage in Western media that themselves oversimplify very complex issues. So they only watch videos or only read headlines or have no complex understanding of what the African continent looks like, what the geography is, what the potential economic benefits are with trading in the African continent, and how complex the history is in general. And I think if you're doing debating just for the results, then perhaps that is fine. But I think you're also doing, at the same time, just because you're pursuing results, a massive injustice to the people who live on that continent. So I think if you were considering more robust interaction with Nepal or with India, only knowing the prime minister's name or not knowing most of the provinces, the states, how their government, its relationship, Nepal's relationship with China, perhaps, knowing how there are certain elements that Nepal needs to interact with the rest of the world. Of course, you're not going to pursue all of those things for the purpose of a debate, and that's extremely saddening. And I think the same thing happens, as it does with other Asian nations, happens to Africa in debates. People don't have the willingness to even interact with how complex the region is as a whole, or the continent. The first thing then is, I think in order for you to move past that, you should really consider perhaps just a tiny bit deeper interest in what the continent can provide. I want to note here, and there is a good debate on it, about how most of Africa is only identified by its anti-colonial resistance, right? So what happened until about the 1960s or 70s, prior, a century before that, and several centuries before that with slavery, that's often the only thing that is mentioned in debates. Colonial resistance, colonialism, the fact that you are poor because of it, the fact that there is low infrastructure, that all of those things are the defining elements of African nations. The issue is that the history preceding that is far more rich, far more vast, and far more interesting to engage with than just that small speck in the entire timeline that Africa has existed in. So when you are only looking at apartheid in South Africa, you are erasing the history of the indigenous people that existed before apartheid and continue to exist today, because their mentions in debates as well aren't just useful because they can't just be used as a tool to get a first in a debate, but they're also important to understand in general, because that ultimately gives you a better view of how indigenous groups in Africa are treated as a whole. It's an important starting point to seeing, you know, how Africa operates as a continent. Just that last point, it's just also incredibly important. The fact that judges and speakers are too easily accepting of the lack of specificity in referring to African countries. So they'll just say, well, you know, in Africa, there are countries that are poor, or they lack infrastructure, or the governments are corrupt. I mean, that is an oversimplification of the issues. Of course, the West also has a massive, is also a massive problem, the way they treat Africa, the disinvestment, the resource plundering, all of those issues, of course. But when you refer to Africa, when just mention specific nations, right? Rather than saying, oh, look at Africa, mention Rwanda. Past the civil war, past the genocide, they've done really well. They're one of the fastest growing economies in the world. If you mention those things, and you mention the attempts to also develop past their colonial history, also their history that may have had bloodshed, it is far easier in that specificity to gain more persuasive nature with your arguments. So I think that is what we need to move away from. Don't refer to Africa as a single country. Don't refer to Africa as a monolith, as something that is uncomplex, not complex. We should be reading more into the specific facts and referring to Africa as a complex, developing continent that has a lot to offer. So first thing is diversify the media that you consume with regards to Africa. So I'm of the view that you should absolutely not read The Economist whatsoever, especially on developing nations. Most of the media is written from the viewpoint of the developed world, what investors may expect or not expect. There was an article a year or two ago on the developments that were politically happening in South Africa with the ANC. The African National Congress is the ruling party. And what it was all boiled down to is one or two factions within the main party, and they expanded that and extracted it to mean instability in South Africa as a whole. Now, of course, that faction has an influence. The question is, does it have the influence to which the extent to which The Economist may have claimed? Absolutely not, because they don't recognize other political players, individual facts. They try and reduce the situation to an understandable 500 words and a picture. So I think the best thing to do is to stay away from The Economist altogether. And if your Facebook feed, if your news that you subscribe to, if the apps that you download are exclusively based on Western media, you should consider trying to diversify. And here's some sources that, of course, I will give you access to afterwards. I'll send the slides. Allafrica.com has an exceptional view of all and summary of all African nations, their developments. The New Humanitarian as well, which specifically focuses on international relations. Africa Report, which I found myself to be a little bit more business oriented. So if you're looking for economic reports or financial issues, Africa Report is perhaps better suited to providing that. So now that you have that idea, if you have international news sources, the BBC for me has been the best reporter on Africa, fairest at least. They have a certain amount of depth that they approach. They have African reporters, entire African news sources, and they don't just outsource that to Westerners. Council on Foreign Relations is also a good source always, because it gives you a bit more of a centrist view on African politics. The last thing that I'd say is you should always should never underestimate the power of Wikipedia, because I think people in school you're taught never reference it, and that's fine because it's community based. But for a debate purpose, it's very informative because it is regularly checked, updated. It is also edited, and then that editing is peer reviewed, which means people check each other's editing to fact check it and see if it's actually the truth. As a basic source, if you just Google Ethiopia right now, or you Google the African Union, you have a very big ability or large scope to see the basic facts on the continent, what it looks like, who the biggest players are, who you need to be identifying in debates, rather than just referring or becoming too relaxed with the easier, more accessible Western sources. I think Wikipedia is a great source to understanding the basics of any continent. All right, let's move on to our next part of the session. Is the African Union even functional or real? Now, just some history on the African Union. It isn't as old as people think. It replaced the OAU, which is the Organization of African Unity, only in 2002. So it was established in 2002 as an alternative to the OAU. This was after the OAU had failed to bring most countries out of poverty post decolonizing of the continent. It's made up of 55 member states, even though there's only 54 nations in, like, formally recognized UN nations in Africa. There are 55 member states, including Western Sahara, which is, if we can go back to the map just very quickly, if you look at towards the north, towards the northwest, above Mauritania, next to Algeria, you have Western Sahara at the top. It's not a formally recognized nation, but it is definitely one that tries to split from Morocco. And as a result, Morocco also tried to split from the AU because the AU recognized Western Sahara. So that politics in the north is quite important to understanding the AU. There's a diversity of languages represented. Arabic, English, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Swahili. Swahili, which I believe maybe a bit more, maybe widely spoken, but as an official language is only in the development stage when it comes to the African Union. There is a very, very large English and French split on the African continent. So we'll talk a bit about that, but it is, for reference, if you want to maybe take notes, the Anglophone and Francophone conflict on the African continent in countries like Cameroon, it has led to bloody civil conflicts that have been very, very tough for most people to even demystify. So they don't know what's happening. They're unsure of how to solve this issue. And it has also spread to the African Union. So there are French-speaking groups and English-speaking groups, which both struggle to not just get along, but get in their own nations to an agreement on how the country should be run in general. The Assembly of the African Union makes all of the most important decisions, but this is one area where I'll specifically compare the AU with the European Union, because most of it initially was based to mimic the European Union. Even though they haven't achieved it, it was meant to establish a country, right? So in 2002, the vision that the founder had, Muammar Gaddafi, the previous president of Libya, his vision was to establish one African state that all traded under one country, had one political goal, and to a large part would also operate for the significant future under the banner of the United States of Africa. The issue is, with that proposal, of course, you're overlooking the vast amount of sectarian divides on the African continent, the complexity in cultures and languages that differ. So even if you have the estimate of 1,200 languages in Africa, each one of those languages at least has one dialect. Each one of those dialects have different splits in culture in which different people identify with that language differently and want their own autonomy. So establishing, let's say you have a motion of unifying Africa along one border. One of the issues would be not just how you would implement it, because in all debates we assume that something is feasible. The issue is the conflict afterwards. Most nations, when they're trying to get combined or losing their borders, resort to conflict in order to solve or protect themselves. In Africa, this is nonetheless also an issue. Western Sahara has not just lost rifts amongst itself with Morocco, but the same has happened in Mozambique. Also secession trying to happen in Tanzania in the past. All of these issues have specifically been related to people losing their autonomy because they feel like they lose their culture in the meanwhile. I think I can go on and on about this, but if you ever come across a motion that specifies African unity along one border, note the complexity in creating a union when there are so many different cultures and languages. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory what the Assembly of African Union does. There are various other goals as well, but these are the three main ones. They set the policies and budgets of the union. They decide on the action that should be taken if there is a recommendation from a specific body. They monitor the implementation of policies as well. If I can draw a comparison that the Assembly may have, it's quite similar to the European Council, where they meet half yearly, they vote on certain issues, and they're represented by a president. Unlike the European Council, which has a fixed president, the president or chairperson of the African Union would be appointed on a rotational basis, with annually, depending on which region's turn it is to be part or leading the African Union in general. So what important decisions has the AU taken? Now, I'm not going to read you through every bullet point, but it answers the larger issue of is the AU even functional or real? It is a real body. It does meet regularly. It has signed significant amounts of policies in the last year alone. The problem comes with implementation of any of those issues. So just look at the diplomacy and research that have occurred in the last year. Easing tensions during the 2019 Madagascar elections. The AU would primarily not take a side, but would just be there for peacekeeping purposes, establishing a demilitarized zone between the rebels and the government, ensuring that you have the treatment of civilians if they need to be hospitalized, having communications with other African leaders on the threat that makes us to their borders. So all the peacekeeping elements of it is primarily what the AU has focused on. They've often been criticized for not necessarily taking action in a non-diplomatic way. So soft power is the primary action. The many proponents of the AU's military power argue a standing military as well that has the ability to take action. The issue is, if you do have a military, who gets to decide when that military is used? How do you allocate funds to that military? That's the same issue that is currently under discussion with the EU, potential EU standing military, is how that military gets used or potentially abused by people who have different objectives. They've commenced negotiations in the Central African Republic, and the Peace and Security Council's work on curtailing child marriages and illicit financial flows. All of these issues are primarily soft power and trying to ease tensions rather than provide solvency for those tensions and issues in the long run. They've established an AU COVID-19 response fund, which in my personal, this is my personal opinion, is how can I put this? A smokescreen to show that they are trying to do something about COVID, but the countries, individual countries, have sort of been left on their own to discover the hardships that occur with the Peace and Security Council's setup of this, as well as the AU's involvement with it. There are no immediate funds available to this group or people part of the fund. The funds need to be raised, and then they're given to the Africa CDC. So you may have heard of the CDC in America. Africa has its own Center for Disease Control. The issue is that it's not nearly as involved in the other nations' affairs. It is primarily a research base and research unit that tries to advise nations on public health initiatives. There is a silencing the guns issue, or not issue as much as it is an initiative. And the question is, how do you take away guns when borders may be porous? So the issue isn't necessarily guns, but the lack of visible policing at borders, or it is how do you get suppliers or foreign actors to stop giving guns or military weapons to certain rebel groups. And silencing the guns is yet again a window dressing exercise that is part of the AU's institutional problem. You can have as many good initiatives as you want. If you're not implementing them in a strict way, in a strategic way over a long period of time, it's unlikely to work. This policy requires most of the states to remove guns from the hands of illegitimate actors. The issue is that most of those states that should be removing those guns are themselves illegitimate governments. And it is most likely that in a place like the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where only recently they were able to oust their leader, Joseph Kabila, the problem became that how are they going to make a difference in the north of the country if most of the control of the borders weren't in their own hands, or Joseph Kabila himself was sponsoring counter rebels against the rebels. It's a complex issue. So you can never say in a debate, for example, the DRC, look at the conflict there. They were able to oust Joseph Kabila. Yeah, but they just replaced him with his deputy. Zimbabwe as well. They were able to oust Robert Mugabe through what they say wasn't a coup, but is essentially a coup. And they replaced him with Emerson Mnangagwa, who was his vice president. The change that people often note in debates is an oversimplification of what actually occurred in most of those situations. There is no institutional change. It's only a change of the figurehead at the top. And that's similar to silencing the guns. You can silence the guns, take it away, have a policy, but if there's no systemic implementation of that policy, making sure that it's implemented and executed as well as it can, then you're unlikely to get as much change as people may claim in debates. So it's always worthwhile to know these examples if you want to try and expand an argument, but also in opposition to say, yeah, it is an argument or an example you can use that isn't necessarily as useful because there's been no fundamental feasible change that has occurred. Okay, so we're going to move on just a little bit from what the AU has done. The answer to the question, does the AU exist, is yes, it does. Is it real? Absolutely. Does it do stuff? Yes, it does stuff. The question is, does it implement the things that it wants to do? The next area to talk about, and just for a moment, if you want to read through the slide, feel free to do so. The African Continental Free Trade Area. That's a mouthful, but we're just going to call it the African Free Trade Agreement or the Free Trade Agreement. An important notice here is that it's the largest free trade area by participating countries. Up to date, 54 nations have signed the Continental Free Trade Agreement. They've agreed in principle, not in practice, to create a single market and customs union, to achieve sustainable growth and food security, and to enhance competitiveness on the global stage. So there's an incentive on most of these nations to try and compete with major economic players. What is the merit for creating a free trade agreement? Because most people will argue Africa doesn't have the ability to fund this, right? Or to facilitate its growth. There's a few things to note. The first one is that 6 out of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are African. It sounds bizarre, but it is the truth. Among them is Rwanda. Rwanda is headed, and whose president is Paul Kagame, has managed to implement a consistent rate of on average 7.7% of growth over the last 10 economic or financial years. This is in many ways even exceeds the growth that China has been experiencing. Of course, you need to scale the growth, right? So the growth has been percentage-wise the biggest, but its nominal value would never exceed the growth that you experience in China. There isn't as much of an industrial base to facilitate that growth. More than that, most of these nations are the center of the African Trade Agreement. So Rwanda initiated this. It's signed, it is headquartered in Rwanda. It is, in fact, one of the single most evident pieces of success in Africa if you have a grip on the economy and have a relative degree of peace amongst cultural divisions. If you can harness those divides or change them, it is likely that you can economically succeed. But there are systemic issues that remain even if you try and implement policies. So in principle, policies are good. In practice, the implementation is difficult. Just a brief comparison, because it's likely that in a debate about an economic union, people will try and compare it to Europe. There is a little bit more difficulty in implementing it. In order for an economic union to work, or a monetary union, for this union to work, you're likely to need a vast amount of infrastructure. So roads, trains, ports. You're likely to have a relaxed sense of border control. You're also needed to have similar business cycles that all work in tandem with one another to facilitate a successful free trade area. But there's one thing that makes that more difficult. Africa is 7.5 times larger than the European Union. So if you just conceptualize that for a minute, it becomes infinitely more difficult to organize effective free trade once you have a larger country where you need more and effective road transport, trains, seaports, airports, which only in certain countries may be very well established, but for the rest of the continent have struggled to keep up with that type of development. Recently, and these are some good examples, Europe has maybe had the ability to develop towards the east, and that was implemented because they can facilitate faster growth through a smaller continental size. But even if that wasn't the case, let's just for a moment assume that Africa was as big as Europe. The base issues in industrial or infrastructural growth requires large amounts of investment up front. And we'll talk about this a bit later with Chinese investment. But African states don't have the ability. There's simply no way that they can get past the historical backlog they may have had against trying to develop or trying to experience some sense of growth. If you have even if you didn't have this massive geographical issue, you still have an issue of historical lack of industrial development, which many African countries can't overcome. That's why they need aid and outside external investment to be able to help them. So I think the sad story of this lecture is that it is a complex issue that requires a lot more investment in time in understanding the statistical analysis behind Africa's issues. But the programs created in principle are excellent. The issue is the execution of those programs without harming African countries in the short term. So I know it's a flood of information, which is why luckily we're recording this, and also we'll release the slides afterwards. But the single currency has been floated and has at least been debated at 3 or 4 international tournaments that I know of outside of Africa. So there's a lot of interest in the creation of this single currency. It should, by the Abuja Treaty, be implemented by 2028 and also administered by the African Central Bank. There's 2 issues with that. The first one is that the African Central Bank is yet to exist. There's no fiscal issue. Even if there was, it is unlikely that it would be approved by the time 2028 came around because of the significant amounts of backlog COVID-19 has created. So establishing a central bank requires investment of resources, requires agreement on fiscal policies, like how are we going to spend the money that we print? How are we going to provide certain aid to other nations? How do we deal with debt? There is no fiscal union, which is what I just spoke about. So this is the same concern that we have about the African Free Trade Charter. In certain places, so in ECOWAS, which is, like I said, the economic community of West African states, they have themselves created some sense of fiscal union, but that's not present in the rest of Africa. Central African nations have attempted to do exactly the same, but have failed because of the differences between Anglophone and Francophone states. The debt crises, this was a pre-COVID estimate, so that's one of the caveats that I must say. But how you deal with a debt crisis is ultimately depending on how a single currency would be implemented. So one state's debt necessarily affects another if you're sharing the same currency, because that currency is used to trade in and out of your continent. If there's if you don't have foreign reserves of dollars or euros, or you don't have enough reserves of your own cash because you're trying to pay off debt, it's unlikely that you'll be able to foster growth at the same time as trying to nurse the debt of most nations. So let's look at some of the statistics that I've added here. The first is the $503 billion. Hello? Gave me a fright. Okay. The $503 billion in foreign debt before 2023 that needs to be paid, right? But notice, most of that debt has increased because of COVID-19 loans. South Africa on its own has loaned about $7 billion more this year from the IMF and the World Bank because they needed to stock up on PPE, because they needed to stock up on other sorts of development programs or to facilitate social welfare. So imagine what the increase in that would be gradually as you approach the end of COVID-19. That would have to be dealt with in a single currency. You can't just magically assume or wish all of these debt issues away. 24 countries have surpassed the 55% debt to GDP ratio. Now, this is a significant ratio. You could use it in any debate as a guideline. In order for citizens to be supported during recessions, you need at least a GDP ratio below 55% to debt to GDP, because if it exceeds that, the interest on your loans that you have taken from international financial institutions far exceed the amount of interest, exceed the amount that you can invest in social welfare. It's a very complicated calculation, but it is worthwhile looking at as you consider what the potential growth issues might be in the long run. As a nice little shortcut, what would you require in fiscal policy to facilitate monetary growth in Africa, but also anywhere? You can go through those 4 things: the labor market, wage flexibility, centralized fiscal transfers, and also similar business cycles. I'm not going into detail with that because I can go on forever, but those 4 things are absolutely essential to establish a monetary union. You cannot have that without fiscal union. Fiscal union is how you make the decisions, monetary and how you spend money, and monetary union is about your interest rates and how much money you print. So we come to the end of the first part of this workshop. There's 5 things to note. The reason why Africa and the AU struggle to implement all of the good policies that they have. On the one end, if you're in favor of these policies, they show good intent, right? They don't need outside-driven projects to be developed. These are African-inspired solutions to African problems. They're already there and they're evident. On the other hand, they struggle to be implemented because Africa is often hit by consecutive crises. Before COVID-19, several countries were still trying to recover from their own currencies crashing or large amounts of debt. COVID-19 hit, which is a crisis upon a crisis, which they now first need to resolve. The sectarian and political divides. So often for the Anglophone and the Francophone communities in especially Central Africa and West Africa, this is a super difficult divide to get over in diplomatic relations, only because they believe that it is, if their one is dominant, the other's policies won't necessarily succeed. Now, whether to you and me, whether those things are fickle and those divisions aren't necessarily as clear is besides the question. That they exist is absolutely a reality that you first need to navigate through before you can say the implementation should necessarily just improve. Infrastructural issues, we've spoken about this. This requires systemic investment over long periods of time. The Chinese may be helping out of that, but at what cost is the bigger question. Leadership stagnancy, the fact that many African countries have been ruled by not completely democratically since the end of colonialism. So this is the stuff where you can agree with a bit more of the mainstream debater. Of course, there are issues in leadership. The same parties have ruled since the end of colonialism. In South Africa's case, apartheid. It's only been the ANC. In Zimbabwe, it's only been ZANU-PF. In the DRC, it's only been Joseph Kabila. There's been very little political transitioning since then. And that stagnancy has meant that countries have been unwilling to innovate as a result. Military enforcement. Should the AU have a standing army? Does it have the capacity to have a military? Does it have the authority to have one? All of these are ways in which they could potentially better implement peace and security solutions without risking just being a sitting duck that eventually doesn't achieve much in the long run. All right, move on to the next slide. So this is the largest geopolitical conflicts by perhaps not necessarily in history, but that are still relevant today. I've spoken about the concerns in Western Sahara. In Morocco only rejoined the African Union in 2017. For a long while, they were the only African state that were outside of the African Union because they believed that Western Sahara's inclusion was a betrayal of their own sovereignty. Now, that's oversimplifying the issue a little bit, but just to make you understand that both of these nations are back in the African Union. Both of them have claimed control over certain areas and sovereignty, and they have themselves created a bubble almost of their sphere of influence. But significant amounts of issues have incurred. It's been a hotbed for radicalization and for more infiltration from other groups in that area. There's no stability on the border, and often that means that you have to trade off the, those actual strategic benefits with the potential trade. So if Morocco is excluded from the African Union, can it benefit from the Peace and Security Council? So they had to weigh that up with the lack of general consensus by the African community that did not necessarily agree with their position on Western Sahara. I've included an article there. Please go and read it. It's far better than me oversimplifying the issue in this workshop. Sudan and South Sudan, obviously different countries, since South Sudan is the newest country in the United Nations. It has at the moment, I think that its establishment as a nation and subsequent issues in Sudan is because one crisis feeds into another. Of course, it's not going to be a constant flow of peace. Since they seceded, Sudan themselves have undergone a military coup where they ousted Omar al-Bashir and as a result tried to reform the state through the Transitionary Military Council. That hasn't particularly worked in all instances because the military council was part of Omar al-Bashir's cabinet, and they have a sort of quasi half civilian, half military government that is represented by Burhan. Now, well, he claims to be the representative, let me rather say that. So notice here just how one of these issues feeds into another. The Tigray region, this was recently debated at the Oxford IV, but also monumentally screwed up by people who didn't even know where Ethiopia was. I'll show you a map now. It feeds into the first issue that we discussed. When you're reading about Africa, are you only reading the headlines, or are you only moving on from what your assumptions are, or are you actually investing some time in understanding the conflict? The important thing here is contextually, Abiy Ahmed has received the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to normalize tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Then he sent in troops into the Tigray region after there had been some conflict or the establishment of military bases there. Now, it's as ironic as when Aung San Suu Kyi also received that Nobel Prize, and then just afterwards started repressing most of the Rohingyas' rights and chasing them out of Myanmar and murdering many people. Those prizes, it shows you how disconnected the international community may have been towards actual regional issues that countries face that may not exist in mainstream media. So often it is overlooked how difficult the transition to a peaceful state can be. And in that moment of transition, where it seems like a state may have transitioned, there is a bunch of issues that can still occur, a lot of cultural divides, and most of those things still need to be discussed, worked out. I can't give you definitive answers on any of them, but at the very least we can read up on what the conflict, what inspired the conflict to begin with. North African split. This is just my own framing of the North African divide with sub-Saharan Africa. There was for a long while a movement to change, to separate North Africa politically from sub-Saharan Africa, and for it to join the Arab League, formerly as Arab states. They're all still within the African Union, but for most parts, their economic trading, their religious and cultural identity, and the languages that they speak, the way they interact with one another, is far more welcoming towards the Arab League and Arab nations to which they are proximate to. Morocco is a bit of an exception, of course. They have tighter and closer relationships with Spain, but even if North Africa had some tensions, the African Union tried to resolve it by making more North African leaders the president of the AU, or increasing relations in trade, making them major economic partners. So Al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, was, I think, just before the current AU president, he had presided over the African Union Assembly. The compromises that are made with other nations are minute, they are very complex, and they're very delicate to understand. And that this article that I've included is quite important to understanding that conflict. Then I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Cabo Delgado because I have a map just next to it, but it is, at least in my opinion, the most important or pressing regional issue for Southern Africa to deal with because of the insurgency by ISIS militants in the north, where the north itself is very rich in minerals and natural resources. So there are 5 articles. If you have any debate on international relations that is remotely requiring a reference to Africa, the way the African Union deals with things, these 5 articles should cover you in the event that you need to demystify what all of these different issues mean. All right. So there is Mozambique. Important is where Cabo Delgado sits. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse, but in this area of the northeast is where most of the insurgency is happening at the moment. The insurgent group has taken control of many mines within that region, oil fields as well, especially oil fields. Now, from the perspective of anyone that's followed the movement of ISIS throughout history or throughout the last 10 years, most of the gaining of wealth have occurred through capturing natural resource centers like a mine or an oil field, using that as a center of creating more capital for themselves, and then moving from that to a more sustainable growth where they can invite people to join their own movement. That specific part of the north of Mozambique is also very, very populous with a young Muslim population, which makes it yet again ripe to being not just exploited, themselves being exploited or invited by ISIS to join the cause. The question is, if you see on this side, I think this is not in English, the map itself, but South Africa here and its connection to the capital city has meant at the moment it is quite far away from the conflict. But other countries like Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia are very vulnerable to spillover conflict in the north and towards the west. Geopolitically, the government doesn't have the capacity to deal with the rebels head on. I think just before Christmas, there was terrible atrocities. There were like, I think 15 beheadings just before Christmas public beheadings of Mozambican citizens, and it tends to be getting more bloody by the day. In the same ocean, you have Somali pirates that potentially want to increase their influence as well. They've often captured Mozambican sailors or people who've sailed on this side of the border. It's complex, right? It's not just Mozambique in a debate, and then you move on from there and you've noted the conflict. The conflict is complex because it directly affects Tanzania, directly affects all the natural resources within Mozambique. It affects all of the nations under this part of Southeast Africa, because they have a larger ability to also have some sort of spillover issues that occur in the future. Note, just as an example or as a case study, when there was conflict in Syria, the spillover effects of that conflict didn't just stay or remain within Syria itself. It spilled over with refugees going to Jordan, where the vast majority of them had gone, going into Europe. Most of the nations here don't necessarily have the capacity to deal with a similar influx of refugees. Even though it might not be populous, it does affect still vulnerable communities that don't have the capacity to support anyone else but their own citizens. In fact, there is no support of their own citizens at the moment. So I think the fragility of this conflict is worth noting. Just as a general note, if you want to read anything on Cabo Delgado and the Mozambican front, the previous resource at the bottom there, mg.co.za, is the Mail and Guardian. It's a South African newspaper, but they've done the most coverage of that conflict in the most amount of depth. And it's definitely something I would recommend reading. The Tigray region as well. And here, just note that I think many of the debaters who may have claimed that the Tigray region could potentially be exploited for naval purposes. Ethiopia itself is a landlocked country. The Tigray region in the north of the country is quite close to Eritrea, which is itself a nation which Ethiopia had only stabilized relations with recently. So it's not that the region is stable or has been stable for a long period of time that we can agree it's worth not pursuing the conflict. There is a lot of historical ethnic tensions that have occurred there, even in recent light of the stabilization. Look at the proximity here as well to Arab nations, especially the proximity that Saudi Arabia has to Ethiopia and its ability to invest, tons of money into that area in exchange for more visibility or, how can I put this? More presence in that area over a long term, especially when the countries are a little bit more unstable and unsure of what their future is going to hold. I think I personally like understanding geopolitical issues with maps, because there are a lot of, if you know something about the nations on this side, you know that Mozambique has issues as well. Kenya has had in the past at least some difficulties with dealing with conflicts that have occurred, or there has been a large amount of presence in Somaliland of people that want to secede. Then you know that the region itself is economically prosperous, or could be economically prosperous, but because of different issues and secessionist ideals that have existed also in the Horn of Africa, you're unlikely to just dissolve all of that over a short run. And it does mean that you have more issues going into the future as it develops. Also, the question of whether or not you should have a Nobel Peace Prize winner have so much influence over establishing conflict within that region. The next slide is called China-Africa. So for the Belt and Road Initiative purposes, I think, maybe I should explain it also with another map, but most of what China wants to achieve is placed directly on the Horn of Africa. So in Africa, they want to establish ports in Somalia and also Eritrea, targeting most of that part, because that is the access essentially that they can have straight through this part of the Gulf. Now, just take into consideration for a minute everything that I just said about Mozambique. It's a country that's struggling economically, where it's easy to overthrow the government, easy to take or capture different amounts of natural resources without any contest against that. The Chinese are investing billions of dollars. The estimate for this project is between $1 billion and $8 billion over the next 20 years even, with that potentially increasing as China's view and ability increases. At the same time, you have nations that are struggling economically. We know as a point of principle that Sri Lanka has had to give over ports to the Chinese because they weren't able to pay it back. We're quite aware of that as a fact. Most of the nations here are defaulting on debt and can't pay that debt back. Now, it may give them a lot of development, but the development is in the form exclusively of loans, right? Those loans need to be paid back to the Chinese state. If they're not paid back, they have the ability to take over ports and take over different strategic areas on the Horn of Africa. This is such an important part because the Horn of Africa gives you not only access to the Strait and the Gulf, but also to Europe through the Suez Canal. Once you have access to that part of Africa, you can essentially develop anywhere on the eastern front, on the Indian Ocean. Just factually, what has the investments into Africa been? Two more articles that you can go and read, which I've myself researched for quite a while. They're also non-Western, so they have a little bit more of a view of what Africa stands to lose and what they stand to gain. But note, like I just said, the investment isn't just generally an investment into Africa, Belt and Road at least. General Chinese investment, foreign direct investment, does target the rest of Africa. The Horn of Africa is the basis of China's access to Africa in general. So a stable region there is important for stable investment with China, where they can't take advantage of weaker positions. Since 2000, it has provided $143 billion in loans to Africa, with an unknown number of direct investments estimated at $60 billion in 2018. For scale purposes, this is not a fact that I have completely checked, so that's why I didn't include it in the slides. The issue isn't the investment. The investment doesn't sound that much. The question is whether or not that scales to China's purchasing power parity, right? So China has a larger economy, has the ability to purchase goods, part of the eastern front of Africa, by providing very lucrative loans or very attractive loans. African countries can't pay that back as a result. Of course, we know that they have the ability to take control. The issue is, does that prevent African nations from getting investment from other actors in future? So if you don't have control over your ports, your roads, trains, other types of freight, and so on, is it a disinvestment or lack of attractiveness that occurs towards your country as a whole if you are felt to be captured by China. The question is quite simple. Is Chinese investment into Africa good for the long term? At least it is intended to be. In the short term, it can cripple you with debt that we have established, if you just go back here, to be $503 billion in foreign debt due by 2023. Just to service the debt, right? Let's say you have a loan of $70 billion. You have $70 billion loan at 1% interest if the IMF is favorable on the terms of the loan. That means you have to pay back about $7 billion each year. Just to service the interest of the loan, you've paid nothing back in nominal value. Africa doesn't have the capacity at the moment to deal with loans from IFIs, so the international financial institutions. If that is the case, it's unlikely that they're going to be able to pay back loans from China, even on the most favorable terms, because they're in such a backlog at the moment. So what is the ultimate outcome of all of this? Why is this harmful to Africa and Africa's vision? If we can tie this entire lecture up, the African Union wants to establish the Free Trade Charter. Along with that, a central bank that can facilitate a single currency. In principle, this is a fantastic idea for simplifying the African economy and for making sure that there's more interaction between nations. And they become dependent on one another in a healthy way. If there are too many external factors that outweigh the internal idea, it's unlikely that you are going to get the political will from all of those nations to implement them. If you have many countries that are skeptic of China, who want to invest in Africa, they're going to be disincentivized from doing so. So in the long run, most of the ideas in principle are good for Africa, even though they may not necessarily be in practice now, as it seems, good for the development because of the debt that is there. I think there's one thing I must say about this workshop. It is by no means an authority or an exhaustive source on Africa. I think there's included in this workshop about 10 articles that you could potentially go and self-study or self-read to understand the continent. The continent itself is too vast, too complex. Its history is in-depth to cover in a period of 1 hour or 1.5 hours. And what the potential of the continent isn't necessarily related with where it is at the moment. Countries are still growing. So despite all of the perhaps more pessimistic things or skeptic things I may have said about policies, Africa has had in the past an ability to supersede any negative or skeptic views. Rwanda is a perfect example. How you move from a civil war and genocide in 1994 to be the fastest growing economy in the world is a pure example of resilience. Most countries may be having difficulties because of cultural divides. Those are too complex to cover in a workshop. But I think with some of the resources, if you also reach out to me, it's far easier to understand the complexity of the region. If you go over this again, there are some bits and pieces that are useful in a debate that you can far easily more engage with once you understand what the initial goal was or the history that inspired those decisions to begin with. All right. So for now, I am done. Let's just stop sharing my screen. Are there